Hello and welcome. Today, we embark on a journey through one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Atlantic slave trade, a period that reshaped continents, lives, and legacies, leaving indelible marks on the fabric of societies across the globe. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492 marked the beginning of a new era that would have profound and lasting effects on the world, including the initiation of the Atlantic slave trade. As European powers established colonies in the Americas, they encountered an insatiable need for labor to work in the mines and plantations of lucrative crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Initially, this demand was met by the indigenous populations. However, disease, war, and harsh labor conditions decimated these communities. The shortfall in labor, combined with Europe's expanding economic ambitions, paved the way for the Atlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, European colonizers brought millions of African slaves to work in the mines and on the plantations of the Americas. The preference for African slaves over those from Europe or East Asia was based on three key circumstances. Firstly, the geographic proximity of Africa made the transport of slaves from places like Senegal more cost-effective than from distant regions like Vietnam. Secondly, Africa had an established slave trade system, primarily exporting slaves to the Middle East, in contrast to the rarity of slavery in Europe. This existing market made it simpler to purchase slaves rather than establishing a new trading system from the ground up. Thirdly, and most critically, the American plantations, including those in Virginia, Haiti, and Brazil, were afflicted by diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, which originated in Africa. Over generations, Africans developed a partial genetic resistance to these illnesses, unlike Europeans, who lacked immunity and suffered high mortality rates. The Atlantic slave trade stands as a stark testament to humanity's capacity for cruelty and exploitation. For millions of Africans forcibly taken from their homelands, the journey to the shores of America was one of unimaginable suffering and despair. The conditions of capture and sale further underscored the helplessness of African slaves in the face of superior force. Forced marches to the coast, sometimes spanning 1,000 miles, were death marches where 2 of every 5 blacks perished. Upon reaching the coast, slaves were confined in cages until they were sold to European traders. The voyage itself lasted for 8, 10, or even 12 weeks, with slaves packed into ships with a fanatic concern for profits. The conditions on board were deplorable, with shortages of food leading to starvation and disease. Documents from the time vividly describe the horrors endured by slaves, with suffocation, disease, and despair prevailing in the cramped and unsanitary conditions. The journey was marked by desperation, with some slaves choosing to drown rather than endure further suffering. The slave trade operated as a lucrative economic venture driven by market forces rather than state control. Private companies, funded by investors who bought shares on stock exchanges in Amsterdam, London, and Paris, financed the trade. These companies purchased ships, hired crews, and acquired slaves in Africa, then transported them to the Americas. There they sold the slaves to the plantation owners, using the proceeds to purchase plantation products such as sugar, cocoa, coffee, tobacco, cotton, and rum. They returned to Europe, sold the sugar and cotton for a good price, and then sailed to Africa to begin another round. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, about 10 million African slaves were forcibly transported to the Americas, constituting roughly 1/3 of those initially captured in Africa. Approximately 70% of these slaves were employed on sugar plantations. These centuries marked the loss of an estimated 50 million African lives to death and slavery, a grim legacy attributed to the actions of slave traders and plantation owners in Western Europe and America, perceived as the most advanced nations of the time. The American Order of 1776, despite advocating equality, created hierarchies, privileging men over women and whites over blacks and American Indians. Many signatories of the Declaration of Independence, who were slaveholders, didn't emancipate their slaves, believing the rights of men didn't extend to Negroes. In the early 19th century, Imperial Britain outlawed slavery and stopped the Atlantic slave trade, and in the decades that followed, slavery was gradually outlawed throughout the American continent. The Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was a pivotal moment in American history, leading to the end of slavery, but the Black lives have long been marginalized in the United States, facing systemic racial discrimination and injustice. Despite progress, racial disparities persist, highlighting the ongoing struggle for equality and social justice. In the end, it's imperative that we continue to educate ourselves, amplify marginalized voices, and advocate for justice and equality for all, ensuring that the lessons of history guide us towards a brighter and more inclusive tomorrow. Please subscribe to the channel for more informative stories.